So let me say a couple of things just opening. I don't want to I'm a professor at the University of Michigan. I talk a lot about opera and race and gender and opera in places where people don't usually think of it. I've been doing this for years, and it's really exciting to see that other people think about these issues too, not just me. I've taught opera in the Huron Valley Women's Correctional Facility, not too far from where I live in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I've talked about opera in South Africa in these first generations after apartheid was dismantled in 1994, and how opera, which had always been big in South Africa as a whites-only segregated form, was something that Black and mixed race people jumped into. So I'm used to talking about opera in places we don't expect it. I love thinking about race and gender and access and accessibility and nation and what we see and what we don't see on the opera stage. One of the exciting things for me what Seattle Opera is doing is that it seems to be on the vanguard of a movement that's happening in opera. And I'd like to say it's also happening in ballet and some of the other arts, but opera, it seems to be, though it's taken a while, it's sort of moving ahead to realize that this tradition, and I know there are a variety of people and experiences in here, those of you who love the opera, who've been coming for a long time, don't want to see that go away, and don't worry, opera isn't going anywhere, which is good, because we need to have conversations like this. But we also realize that some of the things we saw on the opera stage, for those of us who know it well, are a little troubling in today's context. And for those of you who are newer to opera, when you see an opera where makeup is put on to change somebody's race or ethnicity, for example, Verdi's 1887 opera, Othello, based on the Shakespeare Othello, where people blacken up to be the title character, this is a little troubling. And it doesn't just happen once, it happens frequently with Aida, interestingly, another Verdi opera from 1871, and I love Verdi, I wrote a Verdi dissertation. It happens in two Puccini operas that are chestnuts in the repertory, Madama Butterfly from 1904 and Turandot, his last opera from 1924. So it happens into the 20th century, not only with the operas written, but also operas as they are performed. Nowhere else do we have, nowhere like on TV, on Broadway, in plays, in high school productions, do we have, I think, at least in the United States, where people change their skin color to represent somebody else without somebody saying, whoa, we should talk about this. But on the opera stage it has happened, and there are a variety of reasons it has, because singing and tradition and having a voice that can sing a certain role, I'm not trying to exonerate opera, but there's a larger context for that. So what do we do when we think about this now? There are a couple of points I want to make, and Theresa Ruth Howard gave a wonderful conversation to a bunch of people in this Seattle arts community, where she was saying, you know, when we think about who comes to these events, who comes to classical American art events like the opera, like the ballet, and how it feels like an intimidating space, indeed it is. That is not by chance, because for so long these were segregated spaces, and people of all backgrounds weren't invited. So when we think, wow, it's really hard to reach out, there are reasons, material, consequential reasons behind that. Luckily, we're trying to address it and we talk about it, and this is good because it means we can't just say, hey, come, you're welcome, and expect people to say, wait, really, am I welcome? For those of you who go to these events, you know that this can be an intimidating space. It's a wonderful space when you know what's going on and you've got somebody who brings someone and you get to learn about it. But it can be a complicated thing. So there's a history of why it is hard, why we need to do these conversations. Also part of that history is how we tell our stories and how narratives are created. Okay, so just setting a couple of, one other comment I want to mention, setting things up. So these are complicated topics. It's wonderful to be able to say, hey, let's name what these issues are, and then let's move past them. I want to say that it's not as though there have never been operas written by people of color before. We're just finding most of them now. Or we thought, for those of you who might know, William Grant Still, an African-American composer who had the first opera at a major company in 1949 at New York City Opera with Troubled Island, about the Haitian Revolution at the end of the 18th century. Or that we have Scott Joplin's Treemonisha, which is an opera that we know about, we have some of the parts, we know he wrote many other operas, we keep hoping they're going to pop up and be available. But this is a composer who wrote loads of operas. His opera is Treemonisha from around 1911. We know that there are a bunch of operas being written today. So I wanted just to give, and there are more operas, but just a quick overview that what we're seeing, what Seattle Opera is doing is bold and path-breaking and part of an important step that needs to happen. What these women up here with me, we're talking about something that is cutting edge and revolutionary, feels like it's long in coming, and it feels wonderful. So with that quick sort of overview, I want to ask some questions and start, so it's not just me being professor, but to actually start a conversation here that will then move out to include all of you. So Bridgette, if I may, because all these honorifics and titles we have, I just want to move it to just getting down real with the conversation. In some conversations you and I have had, I was really thrilled to hear that Charlie Parker wasn't an abstract name to you growing up, that he was someone that your family knew about, and yet there was a complicated history there. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to this subject and who Charlie Parker has been to you?
Well, I've heard Charlie Parker's name all my life because my mother's twin brother idolized him. He took up the saxophone because he loved Charlie Parker, and when Charlie Parker came to Cleveland, Ohio to play, they actually got together and jammed a bit. My grandmother hated him. She felt my uncle became a heroin addict, trying to be like Charlie, and she blamed all that on Charlie Parker. So since I was a little girl, I heard of Charlie Parker as the devil, reincarnated, and and the reason why her son wasn't a surgeon someplace or something. When my brother, who's also a musician, got asked by the composer of Charlie Parker's Yardbird, he told him he was looking for a librettist, and I'm a playwright and a poet and a playwright. I was not a librettist then. So my brother called me and it said, his friend Daniel Schneider is looking for a poet to write about Charlie Parker, and I immediately said yes, because having heard his name over and over and over again, and really not knowing anything really about him other than what I heard, I know his music was great. My mother kept saying it, my grandmother too, all that would drive you crazy. But I respected what he did, knowing only about that much about him. So I said yes. I went to talk to Daniel. Daniel said yes to me, surprisingly, and so I went out reading and looking at videos and films and stuff, and the books that were written about him. He wrote very little about himself, if anything, really, and you could listen to his voice on YouTube or something to hear what he sounded like. But from that, all the stuff I'd heard about him for my whole life started to melt away, and I started to respect him. He worked extremely hard. Yes, I do think he was a genius, but genius can just float away if you don't really work at it. 11 hours a day, he practiced that saxophone.
A lot of people think of Black genius as something that just, naturally oozes out of people's pores. And we can certainly talk about this more. This hooks into ideas today of the magical Negro or somebody who's able to do stuff. But Black genius is like all genius. It's a lot of talent and a whole lot of work. And that was definitely the case with Charlie Parker. I know we're going to move into the next scene in a moment, but Theresa, I feel so terrible having you sit here with all these great things I know you're going to say. Did you want to jump in a little bit about these ideas of Black genius or anything that we've talked about with relationships and sort of Black kinship structures, whatever?
Sure. I mean, with my time here at Seattle Opera, we've had a number of different conversations, and one of the concepts that came up was the idea that oftentimes when we think about Black genius, we can envision it in sports and oftentimes in music and spaces that we go, the Negro excels at this, and that somehow it's just you're anointed, or it's like a gift from God, which it is, but it implies that there's not discipline and mastery and work and intelligence behind it. And so somebody like Parker, when you think about his genius, his innate ability to understand music, when you talk about how long hours he put in, not just practicing himself, but also in the listening. There's an informal sort of study there that's oftentimes not acknowledged or valued in the same way as quote unquote formal study. So I find that very, very interesting, and I think that when we talk about race and Blackness and excellence, there's oftentimes this omission of the same hard work and fortitude that oftentimes white people are assumed to have had to go through.
Of course, because in order to excel, you must have had all the schooling. But how do you school somebody in the type of music that Charlie Parker ended up writing? He was writing music that was different from the Dixieland Jazz Band and the 12-bar blues, and different from the swing band that he was playing in Duke Ellington. He and Gillespie and then others ended up doing this new style that sort of took the 12-bar blues and went beyond them and did hard, virtuosic improvisations that you couldn't just sit in on and sort of be the welcoming space that interracial audiences or interracial teams would do. This was something that was reclaiming a virtuosic bebop style, sort of creating a scat, which you might have noticed in some of the writing that it's wonderful how this infuses the whole language of the opera, where you get these sort of improvisations that are out there. And part of it is being written as we are going to take jazz in a new direction. That's not just big swing bands for everybody to dance in and for it to be a lot of Black musicians playing for white audiences, but we're going to do saying our words and our responses. There weren't books he could read about that. He had to hear what was happening as he did. And jazz was not taught in schools at this time because it was still seen as very subversive. So he did everything he needed to do to figure out, how do I take this language further? So this genius, that is part of the genius. It's creating a new language that comes after sort of evolving the language we already have.
The classical forms don't honor the visible effort. We're trying to hide that, right? And I think that's very classical music. It's not supposed to. You're not supposed to be struggling.
It sort of happens with dance and music. Yes.
Right, and so
it almost makes you think, oh, maybe I could do that, and then I'm like, oh no.
It's inspirational and aspirational, right? And that's part of what I think the classical forms specifically are after. I think that modern dance and postmodern dance actually wants to pull the veil off and oftentimes show you the work, show you the ugly, make you think in a different way. It's less escapist than some of the classical forms. Dancers often train in different techniques. Your relationship to social dance, your personal culture, all of that is embodied in that. And I think that what is interesting to me about artists of color, and specifically Black artists, is that historically we have been in ballet since it hit the shores of America. I have a timeline on my website, Ballet, MOBBALLET.org. And the first data point is 1846. There's a man named George Washington Smith who was rumored to be mulatto and debuted Giselle in Boston with the Austrian ballet dancer Fanny Elsler. And so we've been studying and in the art for a long time.
Okay, I just want to make sure we got that, because this is new information that doesn't happen in the textbooks. 1846, a brown body was dancing Giselle, very high classical, Aubert is it? I can't.
Well, I guess he would be Blackish. We can say that now.
Sorry, Aubert, sort of the composer, 19th century ballet tradition, and it's not something that just happened only a minute ago, but has been happening as the tradition was developing. Black bodies were doing this.
Right, but not welcome in the mainstream or white space. And so what ends up happening in ballet, and I'm going to assume that in classical and voice and music, is that one, we create our own spaces, but two is it forces a lot of the classically trained ballet dancers specifically to be able to cross genre. So you have people who are classically trained who end up going to Broadway and then dancing with ballet companies. Now this is, when you think about the trajectory of the average ballet dancer and what we're told is like you really have, it's a straight line. When you look at the history of Black ballet dancers, it's fascinating because these were triple, quadruple threats that could go back and forth. It's very odd. Usually ballet dancers go from ballet to another genre. Very rare do you have someone going from Broadway and being in a ballet company. You have Billy Wilson from Philadelphia, who started out trained in Philadelphia classically, went to Broadway, went to Europe with West Side Story, the original cast of West Side Story, and then joined the Dutch National Ballet.
So these stories, this is something I think people of color in the arts, is more of a norm for us, where people expect us to do one thing, jazz or gospel or spirituals or hip hop or, there's so many examples of composers who we know who did popular music, and then also we're trying to write operas, we're trying to get symphonies performed. It seems like this is happening with dance also.
Absolutely, and I can only imagine that Charlie, because you said that he started studying in school, so I'm sure that he studied classically starting, right? Like he learned, that's generally the trajectory.
What you learned, yeah.
So it's also an assumption that jazz musicians somehow aren't classically
wouldn't know any,
right.
And they're so divorced from all music that they just kind of do jazz. Whereas most likely, do you know much about that background with other musical traditions? Was he active, like go to church events? No, not too much. Okay.
No, but he was in the school orchestra, so he picked an instrument. Well, it was always a horn. And he learned to play the horn in his school, which nowadays music in a lot of inner city schools, they don't even teach music anymore. Yeah, this was in the 1930s, so he started learning the instrument then. I don't know when the eureka moment was that he felt like, oh, I absolutely love this, but it may be he wanted to, as they called each other cats back then. He wanted to hang with the other cats in the clubs, you know, and the women loved them, and that was probably more of his teenage thing, like, ooh, if I could play this, you know. But he took it on seriously, and most of the day that he played it, and the whole neighborhood complained to his mother about all of that noise her son kept playing all day long and half the night, as she defended him, saying, no, he's he was a good boy and he's going to be great.
Go, Mom. Defending folks. So I want to open up this conversation to sort of, we've talked a little bit about opera and sort of these classical forms and what's at stake for making something American music or having it performed today in the United States, where we're going to go and see them and have them resonate with us. And importance of different voices. What is at stake when we put these stories on stage, when we show new stories and tell new narratives? In terms of the regular opera canon and what's out there, when we think of Black life on stage, Black bodies performing characters on stage, we go to Gershwin's Porgy and Bess. And there, as I've mentioned before, there are a lot of wonderful things about Porgy and Bess. Seattle Opera did a really thoughtful production just a couple of years ago. But I'm wondering, and particularly in ballet, what some of these, the Bayadere you were talking about before, Charlie Parker is known today primarily, and it'll be different for us because we're getting this more in-depth look, but he's known for being an incredible saxophone player and an incredibly tragic figure with drugs. I guess what I'm trying to do is to get us to talk about what's at stake when we put new stories, new narratives on stage. What is at stake? And that's my way of saying, how do we talk about this today? How do we change these things? I know you've been doing a lot of work with this, and you gave this wonderful discussion or presentation and a great discussion here for the Seattle Opera and Symphony and the Pacific Northwest Ballet as workshops. Can you talk a little bit more about that work you're doing?
Sure. I think that I would have said that ballet and opera are sisters. I mean, they resemble each other, but they're not twins. And so for me, I did enter it sort of accidentally, and because I wrote an article about the narrative of Misty Copeland being held up as the first and the only. As a former member of the Dance Theatre of Harlem, I knew that was not true. But I thought that because of the marketing of today, there was an erasure of that history. And so in the article, I sort of lifted the history back up. And I think that you know, what's at stake is that the classical forms have to be relevant, and they have to speak to the people on the planet and the cities and the communities that they serve. And so in cities specifically like New York City or Chicago or Washington, D.C., where the demographics are a certain way, when we look at ballet companies specifically, because they have companies, whereas opera is sort of more of a transient sort of form, that becomes a real question. And it's not just in specifically the bodies that we see on stage, but the stories that get told. So ballet and opera as sisters, the DNA is that a lot of the canon is problematic. You know, it can be racist, it's misogynistic, it can be sexist. But they're classics, and we have to hold them up, right? But we're all trying to be more socially aware. We have #MeToo, and we're acutely aware of what we're not supposed to be doing in present.
What are sort of taboo things we don't talk about?
These forms hold up this other set of values, and so I mean that's a large question in terms of like what's at stake. But the largest thing at stake is that they will not be relevant, and there's so much other content out there in the world that you actually don't have to leave home for, and you don't have to pay a lot of money for.
And so who's going to show up? I love that you talk about opera and ballet as sisters. Historically, going back to the beginnings of opera in the 17th century, they shared the same stage, and a lot of operas incorporated ballet. So now, I mean, it's a real luxury to be able to have a ballet in an opera, you know, with all of that, but it still happens. It's wonderful. I don't know how many people saw, you know, I keep bringing up Porgy and Bess, but the Metropolitan Opera's high-definition broadcast on February 1st had Camille A. Brown hired as the choreographer, and this really added a different dimension to what we saw on stage. In a way, there was, I think, almost did anybody see that production? A few people did, yeah. There was a lot of, so usually you've got Catfish Row, which is a big chorus, lots of singers, and there's, you know, some movement on there. But there were, I think, at least 8 dancers who were, or 6 to 8 dancers who weren't part of the chorus, who were doing really stylized choreography. And some of that choreography had a lot of hip and buttocks and sort of almost, I don't want to call it twerking because that's going in another direction.
It was culturally specific. It came out of the era.
Yes.
And that is different from the Carmen de Lavallade version that I actually did, which was very stylized in that it was very taking the Africanist form and fitting it into a European context that everybody could kind of feel comfortable with and recognize, right? So in her version, in both versions, you have the cakewalk, but one is more performative in that it's presentational. Whereas, now, just full disclosure, Camille A. Brown is my very good friend. And we talk a lot, we share a lot, and so when you mentioned it in the email, I was like, girl, what you want me to say?
Oh, excellent.
Because I was like, I want to represent you right. I said, I think I know, but she said, I didn't want it to be performative, or like you're performing blackness. I want it to be a beingness, right? And so, because these are characters, but they are stereotypical characters, but they are human. They are based on human beings.
I found them, yes. It was so provocative and complicated to watch because on one hand, it almost felt like a trickster element of, whoa, you're showing that? And yet it felt really, I don't like the word authentic, but it felt like it was coming out of real experience.
But see, this is the thing. It was actually authentic because she's taking the movement that corresponds from that era and presenting it in ways. And the thing that I thought was really brilliant about it is that she the dancers didn't necessarily come out and be like, okay, like in normal opera, it's now the ballet.
Right.
They were
woven in.
They were built in. It came out organically from the scene. Yeah. And it made sense. And the most, looking at it, I go like, they are enjoying their beingness. They're not performing blackness. I am black. This is a part of our culture. And although Porgy and Bess can feel very shameful, that was, I think, a really beautiful element of it, because it was like there's value in our culture, like in our authentic culture, in this inauthentic rendition of it.
It felt so right. I've been thinking about Porgy and Bess for a while, and now I thought, Porgy and Bess has a ballet now. Like, this needs to be a part of it. It just spoke and was another way of Black embodiment. Seeing so many people on stage is really a big deal, a wonderful deal, and to see them move with what feels like a natural element. And I use that very carefully. And I always get nervous with authenticity because it implies there's one right way to represent something. So that's where I'm nervous. Like I am showing you this is the right, authentic way. And it's like, there are usually many ways of doing something. But there was something that felt organic, that felt sort of, I could feel my body connecting with it in a way that I can't connect with ballet in that way. But maybe I'm thrilled when people can.
The other thing that's interesting about what she did with that movement was that she gave them characters. She made them people. Yeah. So every time that they were in the dance element, the personality of the character, because usually they're just the dancers, and you're like, just fill the space, 5, 6, 7, 8, and you're off. But you saw the relationships. She built relationships into the choreography, which made them people who were in the town, right? And so that's a part of the cultural aspect.
They were characters. They were characters we had been missing. They were characters and bodies doing things that had felt sort of absent and stiff when they were missing from Poor Game Best, and to put them in there. Going back to something we had talked about before with just the lack of having people of color in ballet, in opera, a real problem is that a lot of younger audiences are used to seeing integrated spaces, that it's a strange thing to see an all-white cast for a lot of people who we want to sort of learn to love ballet and opera, those young ones under 45. And I love how the young ones go up to 45 instead of just 20 or something. The student discounts or the special prices or, the Young People's Club. So this is something where opera companies and ballet companies need to think, what's happening now? Who's on stage? We want to invite you in and to make you feel welcome. Yet if you're the only one, who's in the stage, in the building, that feels a little strange. So I think ballet has also had this issue.
We're in a very interesting space.
Yeah.
Where and when I'm thinking about it, I'm careful because there's a lot of work to do, but there's a lot of work being done, and in different areas of the field. Like the schools are more porous, and so there's more
that's good.
Elasticity to be able to bolster the pipeline. It gets harder up at the top because there is a standard and an aesthetic that we do want to preserve. And we have to make sure that the dancers that we're creating dancers that are really viable and of the standard. I agree with that. Yeah. I'm elitist too.
Nobody wants to see lower standards. Let's just get that out there.
But I do think that some of the stories that ballet can tell, like when we're commissioning work, we can look at whose voices. Like I think it's like as a black librettist, like who telling a story of a black man, whose voices, whose stories are we telling? And they don't always have to, if you only have white bodies, I always say this, I think it's odd that Atlanta Ballet doesn't have a Malcolm X ballet. A Martin Luther King ballet. But then you can't have a Martin Luther King ballet if you don't have no Martin Luther King. Mm-hmm. Or a Coretta. Like, whose story are you telling? So there's certain stories that you can't actually tell, right? Like, so they don't necessarily have to be historical. I think a lot of times we do that. Like we want, new works about black people have to always be historical.
No.
Right? So right. Like who are we?
I know
who
this.
Who are we?
Fire Shit Up in My Bones, which has become super popular and really is strong. It's about a living person right now.
But it can be, okay, Erica Alexander, who was on The Cosby Show, she was the cousin. Living Single, I was just going there. She now, I think it's called Concrete Jungle. She writes comic books, and she tells the story of how she went into a publisher's office and said she and her then husband were pitching this, futuristic comic book, and he, a white man said, well, black people don't read science fiction because they don't see themselves in the future.
Oh, thanks for letting us know.
Right. And so she was like, okay,
Hello.
let's French press it. And then she went on to kind of educate him about our history of science fiction. Yes, we actually do we actually are the future. But anyway, so that's a feeling. So the idea that when we're looking to what new content is, I think it's really interesting that it's always looking to telling our history, which is sometimes trouble. So finding the positive, lighthearted stories are really hard sometimes, but we can actually create new stories, just like,
yes.
You know what I mean?
Well, we found that this whole Afrofuturism and science fiction, Wakanda, yes, Black Panther, that this is becoming an incredibly fertile area. In fact, envisioning the future is a very helpful thing to do when the present isn't quite what we need it to be.
And black people can tell white people's stories too. I mean, if white people can tell black people's stories, then why can't we tell their stories?
Yes. Who tells the story is important, which I think is a wonderful sort of segue as we're thinking who's telling the story and whose voices are heard. We can still jump in, but I'm wondering, it feels like this might be a good time to open things up for a community conversation.
It's really interesting because I did a talk about exposure, access, and opportunity in the UK for the Royal Ballet, and deconstructing it, right? The difference between exposure and access and opportunity, and what in working it through, what I was coming up with was the idea of culturally. Communities of color not looking at the arts as a viable occupation. It makes sense because it is risky, and when you are already in a risky situation, you need to choose something that's going to pay your bills. Now, white people feel that way too, but when you are from a marginalized community, it's 2, 3, 4 times fold, right? And then if you compound that with the idea that there's a lack of diversity, so you're not even seeing your parent is not even seeing you. That's what they're like, well, where are they? You want to be an opera singer? Name me 7 opera singers, black opera singers. Okay, no, you're going to school, right? That's the truth of it, and it makes sense. And so this is how, when you're looking at diversity and solving the problem, you have to work at it from both ends, because I have to be able to convince a parent that they're going to allow their kid to invest their time, energy, and money so that they can support themselves, so that that's a real thing, right? And then let's do the flip side. Then on the flip side, the people in the art form see the idea that parents won't allow or don't support their youngsters in pursuing that as a lack of sophistication or understanding or value of the art. And it's not. I cannot afford it. We cannot afford it. So that's the dichotomy, that's the problem. That's a catch-22. And it's real. It's real.
I appreciate bringing up these really tough questions, because we've got, being an artist is hard, and there's no guarantee for anyone, regardless if you've got a lot of money behind you and if you don't. Then there's where are people like me when we talk about the lack of diversity. Then there's the issue of if you try to do this is going to be a tough thing to do. It's so I appreciate you bringing this up. One quick way I handle it is a lot of the students I'm teaching are not music majors, but in other areas in the liberal arts. And I think of the training I'm giving them, so sort of music history courses. I've got a history of the symphony, a race and identity in music, opera culture and drama. I'm teaching a generation of students. One, I always try to bring them to performances because they don't feel, and this is no matter what their socioeconomic background or their race and ethnicity, it's seen as an elitist art. So trying to make them feel entitled by bringing them into the concert space, talking about the works, letting them feel like holding their hand there. And I feel I'm training new audiences. I'm training new board members. I'm training new people who are going to be maybe not doing this as their livelihood, but who are going to be nurturing it. And then their kids, they might understand, oh, this is something I want my kids to do. I mean, we all know that having training in ballet and in music, you can't be poor usually. It's you need money to do these things.
It's a middle-class art form. Can I just say one more thing? What we also do, we don't do what sports do. What sports folds people who aren't that talented, who aren't going to the big show, into the industry. But oftentimes in ballet, people, your sole value is in what you can do in the studio or on stage. And if you don't make it professionally, then you're a failure. And so then you are damaged and you don't want to be anywhere near that art form. We need to create, this is a part of the culture, right? So personal development, to see that there's value in you as a human being, and that maybe your skill set isn't necessarily on the stage, but you know what, you'd be a great arts administrator. You could be, you know what I mean? Like there's spaces for you in the field, and that only, we need people who understand the art and love the art to be on the non-artistic side as well. So maybe that's something that you can offer, because that sort of skill set is universal.
Well, unfortunately, none of us live in Seattle full time, so it might be a good way to get a conversation what you guys are seeing as some of the challenges. I'll start just really briefly. One of the big challenges it seems that Seattle is going through is the affordability issue, where there seems to be so many people moving in, which is wonderful and vital for a city, but some displacement and it's very hard to be. A lot of artists start as struggling artists. Very few start as rich artists. And it's great to be in a city because there's like a lot of stuff happening and there's a buzz and there are a lot of people. And then it's hard to come to a place and be struggling and not known and to make it. So that seems like one of the struggles Seattle is having.
I was a closet poet for a long time. And James Baldwin, I loved him and read everything, and when I came to New York to study something else and did, but my passion for writing poems never ended. And then I I lived in Harlem. My brother, who was a musician, invited me to come. He was playing behind Mimì Baraka. And he told me to bring one of my little sorry poems. And so he played. I got up on stage. I was a very, very shy person. But I got up on stage, and I didn't know I was holding my breath. I knew I couldn't breathe. But while I was reciting, I got to the end of the first page. It was a poem about my mother. I turned the page to the second one, and I forgot the second page. It was blank. And I had to say, oops. And so they invited me back the next... They invited me back the next Monday and said, don't forget the second page and read it over. So I came back and I read the whole poem. I kept telling my brother, kept saying, you're not breathing. Take a breath. Next Sunday. Anyway, so I did that. And I read it, and I started going, this is at the Victoria Feb Theater, which is on 125th Street. And so I went back for all these Mondays. And then Phyllis Yvonne Stickney, who's an actress and done a lot, she was the head one that ran the thing. She went off to do a movie, and my shy self stood up and said, "We don't have to wait till Phyllis comes back. We're going to keep going." So I kept writing. I applied to Lincoln Center Theater's Director's Lab and got in. And in a workshop with another group, new dramatists, they said, pick a color, pick a sound, and 2 people, and write a scene. And I wrote a scene. And then the director's lab gave it to a woman who, that ran the group, and she said, finish it. I finished it in like maybe 3 weeks. I gave it back to her. And Wendy Wasserstein, if those of you know Wendy Wasserstein, chose my play for the Cherry Lane Mentor Project, and Ruby Dee starred in that play. So then I was a playwright.
Oh, that's good.
I'm from Philadelphia originally. I'm the baby of 9, believe it or not. And my sisters, we all did something. I don't know how my parents managed it, but we all, went to a parochial private school. If you wanted music lessons or whatever, they figured it out. And my sisters danced, and my mother loves to tell the story that I was 3 years old. We went to the recital at the Academy of Music. I trained at Philadelphia Dance Company. Joan Myers Brown is the founder, and I refused to leave until they promised that I could do that. And so they took me down. I was too young, but they knew my sister, and they allowed me to take class. And actually, by the time I was 8, I was dancing with the 16-year-olds, but my teacher was a woman named Marion Sujet, who was very light-skinned. She looked like she was white. She had green eyes and like red hair. And she was actually Joan Myers Brown, her teacher, and Judith Jameson's teacher. And she was the person that said to my father, because I had a ballet father, take her to Pennsylvania Ballet because she could be a ballet dancer. And so he did. And so he was my greatest advocate, and was always there, knew terminology, sat outside sewing point shoes with the mothers. No, seriously. And so I just had an affinity for it. I think I was probably about 8 when Arthur Mitchell and Dance Theatre of Harlem came through Philadelphia with a show called Doing It. And Arthur Mitchell was brilliant because he figured out the way to bring the Black community in to see ballet by mixing the genres, right? So the show had a gospel choir, they did Dougla, and they did Forces of Rhythm, and that which used popular music. And so in each city, marketing genius, he auditioned local children, and at the top of the second act, the ballet bar came down, and there were 12 local kids who did a ballet bar. And so my father, of course, took me to the audition, and I got the show. And part of so it was my first experience seeing versions of myself. I was like, oh my God, where do they all come from? Like all these brown ballerinas, like I had seen 1 or 2, but like to see this like sepia oasis of brown, and they were all gorgeous. And so I did that, and part of our pay was that you got a scholarship to the summer session. But I was 8 and I wasn't going nowhere. So by the time I was 12, we cashed in on it, and sort of that's sort of how I progressed. I ended up dancing for Dance Theatre of Harlem, and then in an odd sort of segue, ended up writing for Dance Magazine. It's a long story, but I have a sort of windy sort of road that didn't make sense for a while. I taught for a long time at the Ailey School, and in different intensives, always writing, always sort of questioning, and that's how I kind of fell into what I'm doing now, which is I'm like oddly perfectly created for it, because I have the background of ballet, of being an educator, and sort of like being a thinker, like observing the field in a weird way. I was saying to you, I've for years I felt like I was on mute, screaming, and nobody could hear me. And then finally somebody like found the button to go, "What is she saying?" Kind of like that. And so it's been an honor and a pleasure, and I'm always shocked that I have the opportunity to speak to artistic directors, because as a ballet dancer, artistic directors are people that you hold your breath as they walk by, and you're like, you're like, hello? Like, but I'm in rooms with these people, and able to hopefully make some sort of change, so that, I will say this, at Pennsylvania Ballet, I integrated the party scene. The first party scene in Nutcracker. Oh. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
It's a story. You go across the floor, they say your name. Obviously, they put the wrong name. The wrong name with the wrong girl. And I went to get fit for my costume, Paul Chanel boy and Bootmaker's daughter, the poor family. Bootmaker's daughter, in the party scene. And so she fit me for the Paul Chanel. And then I was standing there waiting for my other costume. And she was like, "Thank you very much." And I walk off to the side. She called the next girl up. Her name was Jennifer. She was not that good, but she was blonde and she had blue eyes, and she called for the costume of Bootmaker's daughter. And there they were, the tears, crying, walking down the stairs. Remember, I said my father was my advocate. So I'm crying, and my father's like, "What's wrong?" And I tell him through sobs what's wrong. And my father, I don't know how he did it, he didn't go to the administrator. He didn't find Lupe Serrano, who was the director of the school. He found Benjamin Harkavy, who was the artistic director of the Pennsylvania Ballet, who was like a Buddha of a man with this big and bald head. And he told him what happened, and now I'm between my father and Benjamin Harkavy going back up. I was like, oh, maybe that was a bad idea. I should have just kept it to myself. But he made her give me that costume. And so I had to share that cast with Jennifer. I was very upset. But the next year, it was myself and a Filipino girl named Grace Rodriguez, who was also cast in the party scene. So I guess it's like almost a full circle sort of thing.
Wow. These stories we're still hearing, this is the first one, or this is, wow. So you integrated the party scene. Good for you.
I'm not on a wall anywhere, though.
Yes, congratulations. My origin story is, it's an interesting one in that I think maybe here's the interesting part. I was basically going to say, I was somebody who loved music. My mother's a singer, and she had gone to Juilliard for a couple of years as a high coloratura. Her father passed away, and her mother didn't think it was good for a young woman to be an artist, to be a performer. So when I came along, she was singing in churches, and she sang Mendelssohn and Handel and sort of classical things. So not opera, but she had that really high voice. So I grew up hearing it. And she would sing in the house all the time. And so I had the best lullabies, all these things where she would, and she didn't sing professionally, sadly. I mean, it was sort of a side hustle that she had in terms of, we'd always be special music at churches, but she had another day job. I was slated to be a pianist, but I'm not a good pianist, and I love to practice, and I didn't like to perform. And so this was not good for me to be her accompanist, because I just didn't really like it. I'd sit there doing my scales, and I didn't have the personality of being sort of, now this is about me and I'm performing. But obviously I've been able to channel it from her. But I loved music, so I studied it. I loved reading about music history. I loved listening to music and figuring out how to talk about it. I loved my books and my scores and figuring out what's happening on the page. And I also have this weird attention surplus disorder. And I'm borrowing that from Susan Sontag, where I can just sit and pay attention for hours. So I found opera. I just sit and watch and love it and write about it, and so it's sort of an odd little story, but yeah, that's how I got into it. I was very fortunate that education was really important to my mom. I'm an only child. She was a single mom, and we didn't have money, but I got a lot of scholarships because I knew how to sit and pay attention, and so now I'm having my big moment where I actually get, I teach classes, and that's nice, and I give conference papers, but being with the Seattle Opera is kind of like, whoa, look at me. I get to see this up close. I don't have to just sit back in the audience. So this feels like my big moment in the sun, because I get to talk to you guys. I get to say, I love opera. Here are the reasons why. We've got problems. We need to make it out there, get it out there. How can we do it? You're here. How do I help you? What can we do? So I feel like Mimì now. That's my little story. I know, was there one other hand? Oh my goodness, we have a few other hands, but unfortunately I'm getting the sign. I'm going to be here. We can stay here. Please come down and speak with us. There are larger issues with why we probably have to stop and the timing. I want to thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to Theresa and Bridgette. Thank you to Alex and Alejandra, who are behind the scenes making everything work so well. Thank you.